Hey everybody, welcome back. Now if you're like me and you run 35-inch tires or bigger on your Sequoia and you removed your inner fender liner just for clearance so it doesn't rub, you may want to think about running a snorkel on your Sequoia. Out here in Colorado, we've already had about double the yearly rainfall and we're just halfway through. For anyone out here in Colorado, I mean, I-25 was flooded all the way through Denver. Just even city street driving on trails, crossing rivers, stuff like that. There's a lot of water out there right now. Without running a fender liner, or even if you trimmed it down like I did myself, water is a worry getting into the engine. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to install the snorkel. Now ARB did discontinue their Safari snorkel for the first gen Sequoias. So really our only option is using a generic 100 series Land Cruiser snorkel, which fits pretty good. There is some modifications that we're gonna have to do to make it work with the Sequoia, but I'm gonna pull the Sequoia around the back and pull it in. That way we can kind of work in the garage. We've had nonstop thunderstorms out here, so I'd rather it be pulled in the garage so that way I can keep working. So the biggest problem is right here. If you have 35-inch tires, I took out my fender liner and I actually cut it so it stops right here and it goes all the way down to the front. And I cut this front portion out right here. So with that in mind, the water can go right over the top of this if it's getting kicked up by my tire. Even with the partial, I'm still a little worried about water getting into the engine. So I will be pulling this out and then attaching the snorkel. Now I will start off by saying I'd prefer to not run a snorkel. I'm not a huge fan of them aesthetically, but in this case, I'd much rather have a snorkel on and not be too excited about the looks than to have water go in my engine, hydrolock or something like that. So snorkel it is. Now when we do get it where we want to sit it, if I can hold this, following the hood line, the biggest issue that we'll have to watch out for is this door. So the way that the door swings out, it's wrapped around the A-pillar here. So you know, if a door stopped here, we'd have a lot more clearance. We'd be able to attach it to the A-pillar. We'll have to attach it underneath and kind of make a custom bracket for it. So you'll want to make sure it's far enough forward just to clear that door. So before you go drilling a big hole, make sure it clears the door. So this is what I trim my fender liner down to. It does protect like the wiper fluid reservoir right there. So I'm gonna try to put it back in after. We'll see how it goes once I get the snorkel in. But I mean, that's kind of see. That's all I had in it. Stops right here. Now my biggest worry is because it's for a Land Cruiser that if I don't put it in the right spot that this thing won't marry up. So I'm kind of going to double check, triple check my numbers. I'll get this on and I'll kind of just get a feel for where it is from the inside, measure that to the outside and try to aim for that same spot, making sure it clears my door. So okay, so I did do something a little unorthodox. I got the truck up on jack stands, and it's the way that the intake is, it's too close to the fender, it's too hard to wrap the little rubber S-piece around it. So just to kind of make this easier on fitment and getting it where I want, I actually unbolted my whole fender. That way I can kind of pull it away, get that rubber on exactly where I want, and then see where the hole is, and it's going to be a little easier. So there are just, it's a lot of 10mm bolts. There's probably about 10 in there that hold this thing on. So some across the top, 2 in the back, a bunch down here in the light. To get the light assembly off, there's the side marker you just have to push forward, pops out. You have access to all these bolts. So I think it's easier. I mean, at this point, I've taken everything else off, might as well take the fender. So now I should be able to get that little S piece on a lot easier. So that'll let me line it up with the fender how I want. And then if I have to pop it off, it's real easy too. So I can just kind of line up the holes here. I could finger tighten some just to keep it lined up exactly where it needs to go. So we'll get the S piece on. Okay, now this is much easier if you have a friend to hold this thing in place. I do not right now, so that sounds bad. I don't have anyone here to help me, so I used just masking tape, kind of held it, went underneath, checked it. I actually had to move it back and up a little bit just because that S piece, I couldn't compress it tight enough forward. So I did have to push it back, which means if I went back, I had to go up to miss the door. But with this in this location, even with a little overlap, the door swings away from it and clears. So I did line it up with the top of the hood up here, and I think that's a good spot. So I did mark behind it and kind of put a center line. I'm going to measure between those points to get my center point. And that's where I'm going to drill. Okay, so I got the snorkel mounted. A few things I will mention that I haven't seen anybody else mention is the studs on these things. So if you thread them on first and then try to get nuts on the backside, you're gonna have a hard time getting the holes in there. It's honestly easier to pull off the fender like I did, and then when you get it laying there, line them up and then thread the studs in. So when they're at an angle like this, the holes, when you try to push it in, they're closer at the top than they are at the bottom. So you're gonna have a real tough time. Maybe you could just do one side, hook it, and then stud it in, but honestly, it's just easier to pull the fender off. Pop it back on, line up your rubber. I still have to tighten up all the bolts around the fender and the hose clamps. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now. When I did put the bolts on here, I just snugged them up. I did not crank them down. Reason being is with the contour being different from the Land Cruiser to Sequoia, I didn't want to pull in, tweak the fender without it being on here. So once I get the fender on, I am going to snug those up a little bit more, get them tighter. And then from there, we'll be able to take the heat gun, heat up this corner, and pull the top a little closer just to get it a little more vertical to match the body line of the Sequoia. All right, so I did go through and make this little bracket that will bolt to the snorkel, and then it's going to mount on the inside of the A-pillar here behind the weather stripping for the door. So the way this thing will mount is up in here. It's gonna utilize those two holes for the snorkel, and then if you pull this thing back, there's a little piece of metal here that I'm planning to drill, and then I'll rivet through with silicone. Just goes, I think that goes to the piece around the window right here. So I have to be careful not to drill into the wires for my roof lighting. I'm going to get this thing painted, let it dry overnight. It's already afternoon, so I don't think it'll dry in time. And then that way I can bolt this on, get the rivets on, and I'm done. Good news, got the bracket on. That thing is stout, and door clears. It's about as tight as you can get. So as I went through, I was only able to get the top two just because where the door is at, I couldn't drill that hole. So 2 is pretty sturdy. I did make sure to put silicone on there. But overall lessons learned for this whole thing, it is easier to just take off the fender and do it that way. Account for more time than you think, just things will take a little longer. And if you have a second set of hands to hold it while you kind of position it, make sure you like where it's at, I would recommend that. So I didn't have that, so I used tape and straps and all that stuff. This thing's about as far back as I can get it with the door clearing, so I think it's a good balance. It looks good. It's fairly straight. I did try to kind of make up some of the straight. So this follows the A-pillar here, but this top part kind of still comes out a little bit. So without twisting the whole thing, yeah, I kind of made up just on the neck of that. So the hardest part of this project was pretty much the studs, which is why I pulled the fender off. And I think that's why nobody really shows that part of the install. It's a pain. So take your time on that, measure twice, make sure you get your holes in the right spot. And yeah, that's how you install a $130 snorkel onto your Sequoia. All right, I'll see you guys on the next one.